Hello, friends. My name is Pam. Welcome to the Christian Science Monitor reading for Friday, April 16th, 2021. Here's our first article, Real Journalism? Inside the Battle to Save Local Newspapers by Patrick Johnson. Brunswick, Georgia. There was something about the item on the police blotter that puzzled Larry Hobbs, a former farmhand and store clerk turned local newspaper reporter. A young black man out for a jog had been shot and killed in a quiet subdivision on a Sunday afternoon. The police went quiet. There were no arrests. Something didn't add up, said Mr. Hobbs, who speaks in a country drawl and wears his blond hair long. The question just hung out there. Why? The killing of Ahmaud Arbery and the county's hesitation to arrest the three white men allegedly involved led to local national protests and eventually to the arrest of the suspects. And, for some at least, it put the spotlight on the importance of a low-key stalwart of democracy, the local newspaper reporter. The murder didn't paint the community in a good light, says Mr. Hobbs, but we also covered how the community redeemed itself with loud, angry protests that left all the cars sitting on four tires. We showed the world how change works. We didn't flinch. That's why what happened in the local news is real journalism. None of that means Mr. Hobbs will have a job going forward at the 6-day-a-week Brunswick News. Like many other local newspapers, it's struggling to stay afloat as revenues decline and readers drift away. The U.S. has lost roughly 2,400 newspapers in the last 15 years, about a quarter of the total. Fat City broadsheets now offer slender pickings infilled with newswire copy. The pandemic only accelerated the trend, with over 30,000 jobs lost, many permanently in the last year. Even as TV and digital media jobs have grown, print positions have been halved in the past 2 decades. Laid-off beat reporters aren't the only victims. So too is civic trust in local and national news as building blocks of democracy. And the crisis in a once thriving private industry has become a public crisis that, some say, necessitates a political response, though what form that should take is contested. Nobody thinks Washington is about to bail out local newspapers whose business model has imploded, but they might give them a helping hand. There was a sort of happy accident that newspapers took on an important civic function in the 20th century, and for a while many of them could afford to pay for that. But now they can't, said Columbia Journalism School Dean Emeritus Nicholas Lehman. So what do we do to preserve that civic function? We're finally having that discussion. Blank pages, hard times. Last month, the Kansas City Northeast News framed the issue in graphic form by publishing a possible future, a blank front page. The drastic move generated publicity and donations, and the weekly newspaper has since resumed its community coverage. Chances of massive relief for the newspaper industry are slim, but hundreds of lawmakers have raised concerns about the issue, indicating that there is support for helping the industry, according to a University of North Carolina report on local news deserts. In Congress, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is a co-sponsor on a bill that would allow newspapers to join forces in order to negotiate more favorable deals with digital platforms like Google. For his part, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has thrown his support behind a bill that would allow family-owned community newspapers to restructure how they fund their pension commitment. There's also movement to lift IRS restrictions to make it easier for newspapers to convert to nonprofit status while still selling advertisement. And there has been concrete action as well. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting received an extra $20 million on top of a $75 million stimulus supplement last year. Some of that money went to support local broadcast reporters. Some are urging Congress to include local newspapers in future funding. Even before the pandemic, New Jersey lawmakers had set up a modest fund to subsidize local newspaper options. The momentum is a recognition that when you lose a local newspaper, you're losing the person who covers the school board and town council, says Penelope Muse Abernathy, a visiting journalism professor at Northwestern University who studies the economics of digital media and news deserts. In other words, you're losing the reporter who's going to tell you how you share the same problems and possibilities with your neighbor. Behind this debate is a sobering fact. The newspaper bid has shed jobs at the same rate as the coal industry. The mining analogy is apt. Local papers, after all, provide the raw ore of information that filters up to regional and national media organizations. Taking them away leaves a news void that is filled by social media that is overwhelmingly driven by national trends. Attempts by companies like Facebook to provide local channels are hampered by a lack of content and timeliness. Last year, one such feed in North Carolina posted a story about preparations for a hurricane that had crossed the area days before. An increased reliance on national news sources caused people to lose touch with their community, especially as national news has become highly partisan and more manipulative than informative. That's something that has happened as a result of this vacuum, says Duke University professor Philip Napoli, author of Social Media and Public Interest, Media Regulation in the Disinformed Age. At the same time, many Americans seem unaware or perhaps don't care. A 2018 Pew survey of 35,000 people found that over half mentioned they had seen less local news, but most weren't aware that their local news were in danger of going out of business. A short goodbye. Sometimes a newspaper dies quietly, its readers long gone. Other times it ends with tragedy. Waycross, Georgia, a prosperous old railroad town, lies an hour west of Brunswick, not far from the Okefenokee Swamp. In 2019, the Waycross Journal-Herald, its newsroom shrunk from 15 to 4 reporters, shut down. Not long after, the paper's publisher, whose grandfather had acquired the paper in 1916, walked into his office and took his own life. Only minutes before, Rick Head, the paper's sports editor who was preparing to relaunch the title as a weekly, had said goodbye to his old boss. I think it all just got to him when he walked into that office where his dad and granddad had run the paper for so long, said Mr. Head, who now runs the Journal-Herald from a news office around the corner. A lot of people felt sad that the paper closed, said resident Barbara King, a former reader. That's how we kept track of what was going on, including obituaries. But a younger resident, Shannon Fleming, said the city of 13,000 didn't generate enough news to justify a daily paper. Now, he relies on lawyers and city officials who drop by his clothing store for news from City Hall. The fact is, I'm not willing to pay for local news, he says. Sitting in a plain office with only a box of crackers on a shelf, Mr. Head said he understands the road ahead will be difficult. Some locals don't even know the weekly paper exists. Mr. Head is used to multitasking. He recently had bylines on 35 stories and briefs in one edition. I often pass myself on the road, he said, barely joking. Show me the money. Such stories point to the biggest problem, money. Pew found that between 2008 and 2018, advertising revenues fell by 62% in the newspaper industry. Google and Facebook now gobble up 77% of revenues in local ad markets. But the growth of news deserts can also be attributed to aggressive cost cutting by large newspaper chains that control more than half of all papers. Job cuts leave the remaining reporters trying to do more with less, and readership continues to shrink. That change is leveled at Alden Global Capital, a hedge fund that's trying to take full control of Tribune Publishing Company, which owns the Chicago Tribune, the Baltimore Sun, and a string of other newspapers. Last week, a rival $680 million offer was made for the titles by two wealthy individuals, raising hopes that reinvestment could stave off the cycle of cutbacks and decline. Analysts say not all newspapers are likely to find a rich benefactor, so they may need other ways to survive, whether from government support or nonprofit ownership, but the clock is ticking. We're not adjusting fast enough to rethink local journalism as a public good, which brings so much fundamental benefit to democracy and society, says Victoria Vilk, Director of Digital Safety and Free Expression Programs at PEN America, a national nonprofit that champions writers. While the crisis has led to innovation, it hasn't replaced the financing that's been lost, she adds. We have incredible ideas and outlets, but there's not enough money in the system to feed them and keep them going. A promise of local bylines. Buff Levy is the middle-aged publisher of the family-owned Brunswick News, covering a town of 16,000. He's the fourth owner in his family, and he knows that he may be the last. He's keeping an eye on possible relief from Washington, including efforts to reduce the burden of turning papers into nonprofits while still selling ads, he said. But for now, his main mission is to remind readers of why the news is not just informative, but critical. He will soon begin running a pledge banner that promises at least 10 local byliners per day, and he says he's going hard on local news and is already bringing in more digital subscribers. We are increasingly acknowledging the fact that local newspapers are in fact important to democracy, he said. I think our readers are too. He's being helped by the effort of Mr. Hobbs, who covered two big national stories this year: the Arbery murder and the salvage of the Golden Ray, a ship that capsized in St. Simons Sound in late 2019, with thousands of cars on board. Mr. Hobbs writes several columns on top of his daily story load, including a lighthearted look at local misdemeanors, names withheld. He lets creativity fly. A jerk went berserk, he recently wrote. More serious crimes, of course, get harder coverage. He recently interviewed Mr. Arbery's mother, Wanda Cooper Jones, for an anniversary story about her son's shooting. The three men charged with his murder are set to go on trial later this year. As the interview wound down, Miss Cooper Jones smiled at Mr. Hobbs and told him, "Thank God for the Brunswick News." And then she said in a quote that didn't make the paper, "And thank God for you." Our next article: restaurant workers find a niche dishing up food from home. Across the United States, the legality of selling home-cooked food varies, but amid restaurant closures, chefs have pivoted to cooking and serving meals from their own kitchens, sparking new discussions among lawmakers and regulators. By Terry Tang, Associated Press. Scottsdale, Arizona. When COVID-19 shutdowns hit in March 2020, Mike Winokur, a hotel executive sous chef, found himself without work for the first time in years. Between caring for a 6-year-old son and waiting for unemployment benefits, days now spent at home in Scottsdale were stressful. One night in June, Mr. Winokur cooked up some tacos with beef chuck and beef cheeks. Seeing what a large quantity he had, he came up with the idea of selling tacos. His first test run was a post on the Nextdoor app, offering brisket barbacoa tacos in his driveway. Mr. Winokur decided he would only do it if he had at least $300 in pre-sales. He made $800 in one day. As of right now, I got 300 people on an email list, says Mr. Winokur, who has since been offering tacos twice a week via email and Instagram. If I capture even a small percentage of that, it helps pay my bills. Beaten down by the pandemic, many laid off or idle restaurant workers have pivoted to dishing out food with a taste of home. Some have found their entrepreneurial side slinging culinary creations from their own kitchens. In many cases, that can mean running up against or accommodating health regulations. These chefs and caterers say they need money and a purpose, and their plight has cast new light on an ongoing debate about regulations over the sale of home-cooked meals. The rules around serving food for immediate consumption vary across states, making for a complex patchwork of requirements, says Martin Hahn, an attorney at Hogan Lovells, which specializes in food industry law. States generally refer to federal guidelines, but counties and cities drive permits and licensing conditions. While some states have cottage food laws allowing in-house preparation, those are for low-risk products like jams and breads. The first place I would go is call my local health department, find out whether there are licensing requirements, permits you need to have, and any restrictions on being able to operate this type of business out of your home, Mr. Hahn said. Don Schaffner, a food service professor at Rutgers University who has given workshops on food safety, said home-cooked foods with items like raw meat are a gamble for consumers. They have to assume that proper storage, prevention of cross-contamination, and other best practices were followed. I totally get why the chefs are doing it. Just from a food safety perspective, I can't endorse it, he said. 8 doors down from Mr. Winokur, Ruby Sagaldo and her husband Jose Hernandez spent their weekend making pizzas in a backyard oven they built. Some nights they churn out as many as 30 pies with toppings like fennel sausage, fresh mozzarella, and carne asada. Ms. Salgado works as a configuration analyst for pharmacy benefits, but Mr. Hernandez, a restaurant line cook, has his hours cut. Ms. Salgado's brother, whose hours at a restaurant server can fluctuate, also lives with them. When they moved in September, Ms. Salgado noticed people leaving Mr. Winokur's home with takeout containers, and inspiration struck. She and Mr. Hernandez planned to someday own a food truck or a trailer to peddle pizzas. The pandemic slowed down seemed like a good time to test their concept and earn extra income to be able to help out our family. For foods other than cottage food, Arizona requires you get a license from a county environmental health department and cook in a licensed commercial kitchen. For Miss Salgado, renting one wouldn't be worthwhile unless they consistently sold 50 pizzas. I have to do my research and find kitchens close to us that would be willing to rent us a kitchen the morning of to do the prepping, she said. Both Mr. Winokur and Miss Salgado say they have food managers and handlers cards and are fastidious about cleanliness. They have refrigerators dedicated to their food businesses, and they wear masks and gloves. Like Miss Salgado's family, Tao Nguyen was selling pizzas out of his backyard in Yucca Valley, California, after her home goods store closed. After 3 months, her small pizza operation was shut down last summer by San Bernardino County health officials. They got a formal complaint from somebody and they came up for a visit and they looked on social media for evidence to build a case against me, said Miss Wen, who has since started cooking for pop-ups out of a kitchen at the local community college. It was frustrating, Ms. Wen said, because a 2018 California law allows home kitchens to be used for a micro-enterprise, which involves one full-time employee and gross yearly sales that don't exceed $50,000, but it's up to each county to implement it. While San Bernardino County isn't on board, neighboring Riverside County is. I think this is a really great thing to help people who can't afford or don't have the means or lifestyles to really commit to having a brick and mortar restaurant, Ms. Wen said. Lee Thomas, a former San Leandro, California councilman who works for the Oakland Unified School District, had a side business called Grilly Q, barbecuing food for events at people's homes. Because of COVID-19, he now cooks in his backyard against Alameda County rules. He's worried about getting in trouble, but wants to draw attention to the issue. People are going to do this regardless, Mr. Thompson said. You might as well legalize it, take the fear away from people, but also create this ecosystem of making sure that food is safe. California, Wyoming, and North Dakota allowed limited sales of higher risk foods such as meat, according to the COOK, Cook Alliance, an advocacy group lobbying for home cooks. Utah signed off on a similar legislation in March. In New Mexico, the pandemic has spurred new interest in the sale of homemade canned goods. In March, state legislators voted to ease restrictions on the sale of homemade food that can be stored safely without refrigeration. Sellers still have to complete a short training course, label products, and keep the kitchen free of pets or children during food preparation. We're working on other states, said Peter Ruddock, Cook Alliance's California Policy and Implementation Director. We take food safety very seriously. We just think there are many ways to do it, and total prohibition, which is what we basically have, isn't the best. Mr. Schaffner, the professor, advised that any legislation including regular health inspections and intensive training, just like restaurant chefs would get, those two things would be a really good first step. Mr. Winokur doesn't plan on doing a side hustle from home forever. He isn't ruling out returning to his job, but he wants to get a vendor's license and move to a commercial kitchen. In the meantime, he's prepared, if forced, to close up the taco shop. The pandemic made me realize if my back's against the wall, I'll figure it out, Mr. Winokur said. Worst case scenario, they're going to tell me to stop. If they tell me to stop, I'll make it legit and start over. Up next, how this hotel offers African migrants hope in the Canary Islands by Renato Brito. Puerto Rico de Gran Canaria, Spain. When hotel director Calvin Lukac and restaurant owner Untove Satran said goodbye to one of the last groups of migrants staying in one of the seaside resorts they manage in Spain's Canary Island, the British-Norwegian couple didn't know when they would have guests again. They had initially lost their tourism clientele to the coronavirus pandemic, but then things had taken an unexpected turn. A humanitarian crisis was unfolding on the archipelago, where tens of thousands of African men, women, and children were arriving on rudimentary boats. The Spanish government, struggling to accommodate 23,000 people who disembarked on the island in 2020, contracted hundreds of hotel rooms left empty due to the coronavirus travel restriction. The deal not only helped migrants and asylum seekers have a place to sleep, it also allowed Mr. Lukac to keep most of his hotel staff employed. But the contract ended in February, and thousands of people were transferred out of the hotels and into newly built large-scale migrant camps, or so they thought. We realized that we had a queue of people standing outside when we closed our doors, said Ms. Satran, a former teacher, in a recent interview with the Associated Press at the holiday club Puerto Calma in southern Gran Canaria. Some of the boys, as she calls them, had ended up on the streets after being expelled from government-funded reception areas. Others had chosen to leave the official system, fearing overcrowded camps and forced returns to the countries they fled from. With the rooms still empty, Ms. Satran said she couldn't sleep knowing the migrants would be left out on the street, so they reopened the hotel doors again, this time at their own expense. They were very scared they didn't have anywhere to go, and there wasn't any solution, said Miss Satran, who lives in the Canary Island with Mr. Lukac since the 90s and has a Spanish-born daughter. Today, the family, with the help of some of the hotel staff and other volunteers, provide food through Ms. Satran's restaurant, Shelter Through the Hotel, and care to 58 young men, including 8 unaccompanied minors, mainly from Morocco and Senegal, as well as other West African countries who fell out of the official migrant reception and integration system for one reason or another. One of them is Fode Top, a Senegalese fisherman who left his country in search of better work in Europe last November. The fish in Senegal, he said, have disappeared from the ocean following years of industrial fishing by Chinese and European vessels. Nowadays, one can hardly make a living being a fisherman. To make matters worse, Mr. Top's 3-year-old son needed life-saving surgery. To pay medical bills, Mr. Top borrowed money he wasn't able to pay back, resulting in threats. If I return to Senegal, I will have problems, many problems, Mr. Top said. The official camps have also been plagued with problems, with reports of overcrowding, insufficient food, unsanitary conditions, and lack of legal and medical assistance. Most recently, police intervened with rubber bullets in the largest camp on the island of Tenerife after a fight broke out between 2 groups of residents. The Canary Islands and their year-round sunny beaches normally attract millions of northern European tourists each year, but for the migrants at Puerto Calma, staying at the hotel is no vacation. The islands were just meant to be a stepping stone towards stability, security, and employment in continental Europe, not their final destination. Today is a place of limbo for thousands who were denied access to the Spanish peninsula and live in waiting, unable to work and send money back to their families. They've come here looking for a better life, one for the reasons I came to Spain, said Mr. Lukac. There's only one difference. They are not born with a European passport, so they can't travel in the same way I can. On a recent event, as they ate dinner, Ms. Satran got a text message. 6 young men, including alleged minors, had been sleeping in the streets of Las Palmas for days. She looked at her husband, who runs the hotel, for approval. He rolled his eyes and took a deep breath. The next day, the 6 boys arrived at the hotel, carrying their belongings in a plastic bag. Ms. Satran and Mr. Lukac welcomed them and gave them 2 rooms. Both of them know the hotel won't be able to shelter migrants forever, but for now, they have a place to sleep. If we can play a small part in making them feel safe and secure while they're here, then I feel like we've achieved something, Mr. Lukac said. As the men wait month after month to either move north or be returned south, Mr. Lukac and Ms. Satran try to keep them busy. Volunteers come 3 times a week to give English and Spanish classes. The athletic ones play soccer on the beach or run up the mountain with locals. There's also a lot of checkers and card games. The couple say they hope to continue helping young migrants even after tourism kicks off again and are setting up a charity. In our culture, we have so much that we forgot to appreciate the small things, Ms. Satran said. Well, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, April 16th. My name is Pam. Thank you for having me in your home. Be greatly blessed and be safe until we meet here again.